In the bustling heart of Lagos, not far from Victoria Island where glass towers stood as symbols of ambition and unbridled wealth, lived Chief Obinna Umeh, a self-made millionaire whose name commanded respect and envy in equal measure. His mansion in Lekki Phase 1 glittered like a fortress, with marble floors that reflected chandeliers worth more than the monthly salaries of his staff combined. But inside this house of grandeur, silence often reigned. His children, raised in privilege, spoke more to their gadgets than to people, while his wife, Ngozi, floated in a world of endless social outings. Yet in this silence, there was one presence that seemed almost invisible but ever steady: Ifeoma, the maid. She was a young woman in her late 20s, dark-skinned, modest in appearance, her hair often tied into a simple bun. She never raised her voice, never gossiped with the other staff, and never appeared shaken by the endless quarrels of the household. She was like a shadow, calm, unnoticed, and yet always there. Chief Obinna barely noticed her, except for her consistency in keeping the mansion spotless. But deep within her eyes was something unspoken, a quiet fire that nobody cared to read. One humid evening, when Lagos traffic roared in the distance and the city's pulse throbbed with both promise and danger, that calm shadow would be tested. News spread across the neighborhood of robberies hitting wealthy homes with merciless efficiency. Armed men, bold enough to challenge security guards, had been raiding mansions, leaving fear and chaos in their wake. Panic gripped the estate. Chief Obinna's wife wept at night, his children begged him to move them to London, and even the guards were restless, their eyes darting at every sound. But Ifeoma, the maid, walked the corridors with the same composed stride, her slippers making soft echoes against the tiles. She didn't flinch when gates slammed, nor when the family argued about security upgrades. Instead, she kept polishing the silverware, folding laundry, and whispering prayers under her breath. Chief Obinna, though distracted by business calls, noticed her once, her calm face reflected in the window while his own sweat-drenched features trembled with worry. For the first time, he wondered, why is she not afraid? What does she know that we don't? That question, born out of suspicion and curiosity, would become the seed of a revelation that would shake his world and eventually shock an entire nation. The night the first real test came, Lekki Phase 1 seemed swallowed in a storm of whispers. The estate WhatsApp group had been buzzing since dusk. They hit House 14 last night, stripped the family of cash, jewelry, even the wife's wedding ring. Security is useless. These boys are armed with AK-47s. Everyone should keep their generators off, light attracts them. Inside the Umeh mansion, tension was thick enough to choke on. Chief Obinna had doubled the number of guards at the gate, men whose faces revealed more fear than confidence, while Ngozi packed gold bangles and lace wrappers into a suitcase, insisting she couldn't be caught unprepared. The children, Dara and Samto, hovered close to their mother, their eyes darting toward the door with every distant sound. But in the corner of the sitting room, Ifeoma moved with the same quiet pace, collecting empty glasses, wiping sweat from the marble table, and humming softly under her breath. Her calmness stood in stark contrast to the storm raging in the family. At one point, when Ngozi screamed at her, "Why are you humming at a time like this? Don't you have sense? Can't you see robbers are outside?" Ifeoma only bowed slightly, her lips still pressed to quiet him, and returned to arranging the pillows on the couch. The scolding bounced off her like pebbles against stone. Chief Obinna, startled by the unflinching way she carried herself, studied her carefully. For the first time, he realized that the woman everyone treated like background noise was perhaps the only one in the house not ruled by fear. The gate rattled at midnight. The sound shot through the mansion like a bullet. Ngozi dropped her suitcase, and Samto wailed in terror. "Daddy! They're here!" Dara cried, clutching her father's Agbada sleeve as though it could shield her from the world. The guards outside shouted, their voices trembling as they argued with men on the other side. "Open this gate or we'll scatter everything," a robber barked, his voice thick with menace. The air in the mansion froze. Ngozi fell on her knees, praying aloud, while Obinna grabbed his phone, trying to dial the estate security team. The generator had been switched off earlier, so the house was cloaked in darkness, save for the faint glow of rechargeable lamps. Amid the panic, Ifeoma walked calmly to the dining table, took a lantern, and lit it with the steady hand of someone setting the stage for an ordinary evening. Her face, illuminated by the glow, bore no trace of fear. Instead, her eyes sharpened with a strange resolve. She turned to Obinna and, for the first time since she entered his home years ago, spoke with authority. "Sir, please gather your family and stay in the inner room." "Do not come out until I say so." The command in her voice stunned him. Ngozi, trembling, hissed, "Is this maid mad? Who are you to give orders in this house?" But Obinna, desperate and strangely trusting her calmness, nodded. Something about the way she held that lantern, unwavering, fearless, told him that she knew what she was doing. And in that instant, the line between master and servant blurred, if only for a moment. The mansion's steel gate groaned as though it carried the weight of the entire world, shaking under the battering of armed men outside. The guards, who had been hired to protect the Umeh household, soon crumbled under the pressure. Shouts turned to pleas, and in moments, the robbers' threats drowned out every other sound. "We warned you!" One of them barked, followed by the chilling clatter of gunfire in the air, warning shots that made the night itself tremble. Ngozi screamed and clutched her children to her chest, as if she could melt them into her skin. Chief Obinna, heart pounding like a drum, stood frozen between fight and flight, phone slipping from his sweaty palm. He had built empires, crushed rivals in business, and survived the brutal streets of Onitsha as a boy. But in that moment, he was reduced to fear. Only Ifeoma moved, steady and unhurried. She set the lantern carefully on the floor, walked to the massive living room window, and peeked through the curtains with the composure of a woman inspecting the weather. Her movements were deliberate, almost calculated, her breathing calm while everyone else gasped like drowning victims. She whispered something under her breath, not a desperate prayer like Ngozi's frantic wails, but a measured chant, low and steady, as if she were reciting words older than time. The gate finally gave way with a thunderous clang, crashing against the wall. Heavy boots stormed the compound, and the muffled growls of men echoed closer. Inside, the family shrieked and stumbled toward the inner room, but Obinna's eyes lingered on Ifeoma. She was still by the window, her gaze unwavering, her face lit faintly by the lantern's glow. It was then that he noticed the subtle detail he had overlooked for years, the way her hands never trembled, the way her eyes darted not in panic but in quiet observation, as though she had seen worse than this night could offer. "Move inside now," she ordered again, her voice carrying the kind of sharp authority usually reserved for generals, not maids. The robbers burst into the compound, their voices filling the night. "Bring out the Oga! We know he's inside," one roared, his tone dripping with greed and arrogance. Obinna staggered toward the inner room, but his mind was torn. Who exactly was this woman who dared to stand firm when the walls shook with danger? Ngozi dragged him in, furious at his hesitation. Yet even as the heavy boots drew closer to the main door, Ifeoma stood her ground, her figure framed against the flickering lantern light like a sentinel. And when the door finally swung open, revealing men in black masks and cocked rifles, she neither screamed nor fainted. Instead, she looked them straight in the eye, her lips curling into words nobody in the house could yet hear. In that moment, her calm became a mystery that would soon rewrite everything they thought they knew about her. The robbers stormed into the sitting room with a force that rattled the chandeliers and sent shadows scattering across the high walls. Their boots thudded against the marble floor, their rifles swinging as they barked threats. "Where is Chief Obinna? Bring him out before we count 3, one of them shouted, his voice like gravel rubbed against iron. The housemaids who had hidden in corners began to sob uncontrollably, and Ngozi, from inside the inner room, wailed prayers in a trembling voice that could be heard through the thick wooden door. Yet there stood Ifeoma, her body planted firmly in the center of the living room, the lantern at her feet casting an unearthly glow that made her look less like a maid and more like a guardian carved out of shadows and firelight. Her eyes met the leader's, steady and without the slightest flicker of panic. The men, taken aback, paused for half a second, and in that half second, the atmosphere shifted. They expected screams, begging, people sprawling on the ground for mercy. Instead, they were confronted by silence and a gaze that held no fear. One of them raised his gun toward her chest. "Woman, move or die," he spat, but Ifeoma didn't flinch. She raised her chin and spoke words that shocked even Chief Obinna, who was peering through the crack of the inner room door. "This is not your house to conquer tonight," she said evenly. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried such weight that for a moment, even the robbers blinked in confusion, as though the walls themselves had swallowed her words and returned them with authority. The leader snarled and stepped forward, pressing the muzzle of his rifle close to her forehead. The other robbers spread out, overturning chairs and kicking at the polished furniture. Still, Ifeoma's calmness held, unnerving them in ways bullets could not. Then, like someone unveiling a hidden chapter of her life, she did something no one in that house could have anticipated. With a speed that betrayed her modest frame, She reached up, gripped the rifle's barrel, and twisted it sideways with precise force. The man stumbled back, caught off guard, while the weapon clattered to the marble. The others roared in disbelief, raising their guns, but in that instant, Ifeoma's entire posture changed. Gone was the invisible maid who had folded laundry in silence. In her place stood a woman with the poise of someone trained for moments exactly like this. "If you shoot here," she said, her voice cold and sharp, "you'll never leave alive. Choose wisely." Her words weren't empty. Her stance alone, balanced and ready, betrayed knowledge of combat that no ordinary housemaid could possess. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence shaken. Chief Obinna's jaw dropped. His wife muffled a scream inside the inner room. Who was this woman who had lived under their roof for years, sweeping floors and scrubbing plates, yet now stood as though she owned the night itself? Outside, the air was still, the city's chaos muted. Inside, the revelation had just begun, and before dawn, the world would learn that Ifeoma carried a past none of them had imagined. The room froze in a tension so thick it seemed the air itself had stopped breathing. The robbers, who had stormed in with the arrogance of lions among sheep, now found themselves faltering under the steady gaze of a woman they had dismissed as nothing but a housemaid. The leader stumbled back from the weapon she had twisted from his grip, his face dark with humiliation, but beneath the mask of anger there flickered something else, recognition. "You," he hissed, squinting at her face as though trying to confirm a memory buried deep. "I know you." Ifeoma didn't respond, but her silence was louder than 1,000 confessions. Chief Obinna, still peeking through the door crack, felt the hairs on his arm rise. Could it be true that his maid, the one he'd ignored for years, had a history tangled with the very men terrorizing Lagos? The robbers murmured among themselves, their guns still raised but their bravado slipping. "Oga, make we no waste time," one of them urged. "Collect the money, carry gold, let's move." But the leader's eyes never left Ifeoma. He spat on the floor, his pride stung. "Do you think standing here calm will save you? Do you think we fear a woman?" he barked. Yet his voice cracked slightly, betraying unease. Ifeoma finally spoke, her tone low, commanding, like thunder rolling from a distant sky. "You fear more than a woman. You fear the truth you buried." The lantern at her feet flickered as though it, too, bent to the weight of her words. She stepped forward, and for the first time the robbers retreated, their boots shuffling back unconsciously. Her calm was not just courage. It was the confidence of someone who had seen these kinds of men before, someone who understood the codes they lived and killed by. Then she said the words that cracked the room open like lightning. "Ijike, son of Okafor from Ajigunal, you used to be called Junior." The leader froze, his mask slipping, his hands tightening on the empty air where his rifle should have been. The other men gasped. Nobody outside their small brotherhood should have known his name, let alone his past. Chief Obinna's heart pounded harder than ever. Ifeoma, his maid, not only knew their names but their roots. "How?" the robber whispered, his voice shaking. Ifeoma tilted her head, her calm eyes piercing. "Because once upon a time, I walked among shadows darker than this night. And if I survived those days, don't think I will bow to you now." Her words carried the authority of a soldier, the clarity of a survivor, the warning of someone who had lived through blood and fire. Suddenly, it was no longer a robbery, it was a reckoning. And for the Umeh family hiding in the inner room, it was the first glimpse that the quiet maid in their house carried a past that could shake even the cruelest men. The silence that followed Ifeoma's revelation was like a blade hanging midair. The robbers, who had marched into the mansion with wild swagger, now looked at one another in disbelief. Fear, that same weapon they had wielded against countless families, crept into their own eyes. Ijike, the leader, gritted his teeth and tried to recover his balance. "Don't listen to her," he barked, though his voice betrayed a tremor. "She's bluffing." But his men weren't convinced. The way she had called his name, the exact cadence, the detail of his father's lineage, it was not the guess of a desperate maid. It was knowledge carved from proximity, knowledge too precise to deny. One of the younger robbers shifted uneasily, his gun hand trembling. "Oga, how she take Sabi your name like that?" "What'n day happen?" he muttered. Ijike snarled, slapping him across the head, but the blow only deepened the tension. Ifeoma did not move. She stood there like a shadow carved into stone, lantern light painting her frame with eerie authority. Her calm had become something larger than bravery. It was a power, a command over the very air of the room. Behind the door, Chief Obinna clutched his wife and children closer, his mind racing faster than his heartbeat. Who is this woman? He thought, sweat dripping into his eyes. And why does she know the devils by name? The standoff stretched until Ejike finally broke the silence. He ripped off his mask, revealing sharp eyes hardened by the street, but now unsettled. "You don't belong here," he spat. "Not in this fine mansion, polishing plates for a man who thinks money can buy him peace. Tell me, Ifeoma, what game are you playing?" At the sound of her name rolling from his lips, Obinna stiffened. He hadn't realized until that moment that in all the years she had served him, he had never once heard her name spoken with such weight. Ifeoma lifted her chin slightly, her eyes unblinking. "No game," she said softly. "I chose silence long ago. But when silence meets arrogance, it must speak." Her words hit Ejike like a slap, drawing a chorus of uneasy murmurs from his gang. One of them lowered his gun altogether, stepping back. Another whispered, "This woman fit spoil everything for us tonight." The fragile authority Ejike had over his men was cracking. Chief Obinna, peering through the crack, realized with dawning clarity that his family's survival no longer depended on guards, money, or luck. It rested in the hands of the woman he had dismissed for years. And as the lantern flame swayed, casting long shadows across the armed men, it became clear to everyone in that mansion that the robbery had shifted. It was no longer about wealth or gold. It was about the past Ifeoma carried, the secret she had buried, and the reckoning she was forcing into the open. Ejike's lips trembled, though rage masked his fear. His men exchanged glances, their fingers restless on their triggers, but not one dared to fire. The mansion felt less like a crime scene and more like a courtroom, and Ifeoma, the quiet maid who had swept corridors unnoticed for years, now stood as judge and witness. The lantern glowed brighter, as though the room itself demanded her story. "You think I don't know you," she said, her voice calm, steady, unhurried. "But I know all of you. Years ago, before I chose this path, I lived where you lived. I saw what hunger did to boys who had dreams. I saw how the streets dragged you, Ejike, into shadows you could not escape. You were the small boy who carried crates at Mile 2 Motor Park, the boy who begged my mother for food when your father's debts left you nothing. Do you remember me now?" Her words cut deeper than any bullet. Ejike's jaw tightened, his breath short, his eyes flicking from her face to the floor as if the weight of recognition was too much. The younger robbers shifted nervously, whispering. One of them finally blurted out, "Oga, not true? You sabi am from before?" Ejike growled, but his silence betrayed his answer. Behind the inner door, Obinna's ears rang with every word. His wife clung to him, muttering prayers, while his children buried their faces in her arms. But Obinna couldn't look away from the crack where Ifeoma stood like a flame refusing to bow to the storm. A memory flickered in his mind, the way she had always kept to herself, the scars he had once glimpsed on her forearm, the haunted way she sometimes stared into the night when she thought no one was watching. He had dismissed them then, chalked them up to poverty's harsh hand. But now, as her words stripped Ejike bare, Obinna felt a chill crawl up his spine. His maid was no ordinary woman. She was a survivor of a world darker than anything he had ever known. Ejike tried to sneer, to claw back control. "So what if you know me?" he spat. "That doesn't save you tonight." But Ifeoma's eyes glinted with quiet fire. "I am not here to save myself," she said, her voice low but carrying. "I am here to stop you, not for this family alone, but for every family you have broken." Her calmness was no longer just unsettling. It was a weapon, slicing through the bravado of men who had lived off fear. The mansion fell silent again, except for the pounding hearts of those hiding behind walls and the heavy breathing of robbers caught between greed and a ghost from their past. The air in the mansion shifted from raw terror to a strange, suffocating tension. Ejike's men, who had marched in with chests puffed out and guns raised high, now shuffled uncertainly, their unity crumbling like old cement. They had seen Ejike silence men with a glance. They had watched him strike fear into policemen and rival gangs alike. But now they watched him stumble before a maid who had no weapon in her hand, only truth in her mouth. One of the men, a lanky youth with restless eyes, muttered, "Oga, this woman day shake you. Now who she be SEF? Abi not police set up?" His voice cracked with doubt, and the others murmured, their eyes darting between Ejike and Ifeoma. Ejike exploded with fury, spinning on them. "Shut up. I said shut up," he roared, but his anger only deepened their unease. They had never seen him rattled, never seen sweat drip down his brow in the face of a woman who should have been on her knees begging for life. Ifeoma, sensing their fear, took one deliberate step forward, her calm radiating like a command. "Look at you," she said, her voice cutting through their whispers. You entered this house thinking you owned the night. But even now, your boy's trapped in a game you cannot control. You call yourselves men, but do you know what men do? Men protect. Men build. Not destroy. You, she turned her gaze to Ajike, you lead them to ashes, and even they are beginning to see it. Her words, calm yet razor-sharp, split the gang down the middle. Behind the inner room door, Obinna gripped the knob with trembling hands, torn between bursting out to defend his maid and staying hidden to shield his children. He had never in his life seen power like this, not in boardrooms, not in government houses, not in all his years of chasing wealth. Power, he realized, was not always in guns or money. Sometimes it was in truth spoken without fear. One of the robbers lowered his weapon, his eyes darting nervously. "Oga, this thing no pure," he muttered. Another shifted back, sweat beading on his forehead. Ajike's fury boiled over. He lunged at Ifeoma, his bare fists swinging to reassert his dominance. But she was faster. With a swift, practiced movement, she sidestepped, grabbed his arm, and twisted it behind his back in a lock that made him howl in pain. The entire gang froze. Their leader, the man they worshipped in shadows, was bent, groaning, at the hands of the maid they had mocked seconds ago. "Shoot her!" Ajike screamed through clenched teeth, but none of his men moved. Their fingers hovered uselessly over their triggers, but not one dared pull. They weren't just afraid of bullets missing. They were afraid of the force standing before them, the woman who seemed to know the deepest corners of their pasts. And in that moment, Chief Obinna finally understood. Ifeoma was not only calm because she had nothing to fear. She was calm because she had once been fire itself, and tonight the fire was back to claim its place. The muffled cries of Ngozi and the children behind him stabbed at Chief Obinna's chest as he gripped the doorknob, his knuckles white. His instincts screamed for him to stay hidden, to protect his family at all costs, but his spirit was drawn toward the scene unfolding in his own sitting room. Through the narrow gap, he had watched Ifeoma, the maid who had scrubbed his floors in silence, pin Ajike like a schoolboy caught stealing meat from a pot. Her movements were not those of chance, but of training, precise and deliberate, the kind of efficiency that only years of discipline could produce. She was no ordinary house help, and as Ajike writhed under her grip, barking orders his own men ignored, Obinna knew he could no longer stay caged behind that door. Something within him cracked, pride perhaps, or guilt for the years he had reduced her existence to background noise. Slowly, with his heart thundering, he opened the door and stepped into the lantern's glow. The air stilled. His wife gasped, begging him to return, but he kept walking, his bare feet cold against the marble. Every robber turned their eyes to him, but their guns did not rise. For the first time since the invasion began, it was not fear that filled Obinna, it was an unfamiliar mix of shame and awe. His gaze locked on Ifeoma, and though her face remained calm, there was the faintest flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Ifeoma," his voice trembled, the name tasting foreign on his tongue. "Who are you?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Ajike spat from the floor, his pride wounded. "She is not who you think she is. She was one of us once. Don't let her fool you." His words rang desperate, a drowning man clutching at air. Ifeoma released him with a shove, and he stumbled to the floor, clutching his arm. She turned to Obinna, her expression unreadable. For years, he had barely looked at her beyond the tasks she performed. Now he searched her face like a man trying to read scripture for the first time, hoping for answers that would explain why the balance of power in his house had shifted to the woman who had once fetched his water. She inhaled slowly, her chest rising and falling with a calm that was both unsettling and magnetic. "I was many things before I came here," she said, her voice steady. "I have fought battles you cannot imagine, seen blood spill until the earth itself refused to drink more. But I laid it down, Chief. I chose silence. I chose to bury that life so I could survive." Her eyes hardened as she looked at Ajike. "And tonight, shadows came knocking at my door again." The robbers murmured, uneasy, while Obinna stood frozen. The revelation shattered the world he thought he knew. His maid was not just a survivor of poverty, she was a woman forged in fire, a woman whose past now bled into his present. And though fear still lingered in the room, there was also something else, respect, reluctant but undeniable, that shifted from the robbers' guns to the woman they now realized was not prey, but predator. The mansion had become a theater of silence, the kind where even the tick of a wall clock seemed deafening. Ajike sat on the floor, clutching his twisted arm, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. His men, once so eager to terrorize, stood scattered with their weapons sagging uselessly in their hands. They weren't just confused, They were conflicted. Their leader was subdued, their mission unsettled, and in the middle of it all stood Ifeoma, still as stone, her calm more dangerous than any gunshot. Chief Obinna remained rooted near the doorway, his heart still pounding, his wife and children whimpering behind him. Every eye in the room was fixed on the maid, who wasn't just a maid anymore. Ifeoma's voice broke the stillness, deliberate and measured. You came here for money. For gold. For what you think will fill the hunger inside you. But what you forget is this. Hunger doesn't end with stolen wealth. It grows until it swallows you whole. She let her words hang like smoke before stepping closer to the trembling robbers. I have seen boys like you turn to men, then to corpses, buried in shallow graves no one remembers. I buried brothers in that same earth. She looked at Ejike, her eyes burning with quiet rage. And I buried you too, Junior. The boy I once knew died long ago. What stands before me is nothing but a shadow. Her words struck harder than bullets. One of the robbers, the youngest, dropped his weapon altogether, his chest heaving. Ani abeg. I no fit do this again, he whispered, voice cracking under the weight of her truth. Another shifted, torn between loyalty to Ejike and the fear that Ifeoma's calmness carved into their bones. Ejike growled like a wounded beast, trying to claw back his dominance. Don't listen to her. She abandoned us. She ran while the rest of us bled in the gutters. His words spit venom, but the gang's resolve was already fracturing. Ifeoma stepped closer, the lantern's glow sharpening her features until she looked almost unearthly. I didn't run, she said coldly. I chose life. And I chose silence so I wouldn't drown in the blood that followed me. Then she lifted her chin, her voice turning sharp as a blade. But tonight, I will not be silent. Tonight, you will choose. Either drop those guns and walk out of this house alive, or raise them, and none of you will see the morning. Her declaration carried such finality that even Chief Obinna felt a chill race through his veins. The robbers shifted, their loyalty cracking, their fear gnawing at their bravado. The choice was laid bare. Wolves, once united in hunger, now had to decide whether to bare their teeth, or retreat before the fire they had awakened. The lantern flickered as if it, too, sensed the trembling in the room. Ejike's chest rose and fell in furious heaves, his mask of power slipping with every breath. His men looked at him not with the blind loyalty that had carried them into countless robberies, but with eyes heavy with doubt. The youngest robber, the one who had dropped his gun, shook his head violently, tears glistening in the faint light. I can't do this again, Oga. Not tonight, he whispered, his voice cracking. Ejike snarled, his pride flaring like a cornered beast. Pick that gun up, coward, he roared, but the command no longer carried the weight it once did. Another robber, broader and older, shifted uneasily. His eyes darted to Ifeoma, then back to Ejike. Oga, this woman sabi things we no fit explain. She dey call your name, dey talk as if she know our blood. Maybe we should leave. His words spread like fire through dry grass. For the first time, Ejike felt his grip on his men slipping away. Ifeoma didn't move. Her stillness was her weapon, pressing them harder than chains could. She simply folded her arms across her chest, her eyes fixed on Ejike with the calm of someone who knew the battle had already shifted in her favor. The breaking point came fast. Ejike lunged for the young robber who had dropped his weapon, his fist raised to strike. But before the blow could land, another of his men blocked him, grabbing his arm. Enough, Ejike, the man snapped, his voice ringing with frustration. You dey lead us to death. This woman no ordinary. Look at her, look at us. We no dey win this one. The room gasped. For years, Ejike's authority had been absolute, unchallenged. Now his own men were standing against him. Rage distorted his face as he shoved the man back. Traitors, he spat, his voice shaking with fury. But his words only deepened the fracture. Two more robbers lowered their guns, their eyes refusing to meet his. Ifeoma finally spoke, her tone as sharp as glass. You see now? The fear you fed them with is starving. They are no longer your men, Ejike. They are free to choose. Her words hit harder than bullets. The men shuffled, caught between shame and relief, as though her voice had unlocked chains they hadn't realized they wore. Ejike's roar filled the mansion. You fools! You will regret this. But even as he bellowed, his men stepped back from him, their loyalty collapsing in pieces on the marble floor. For the first time, the predator stood alone. Ejike's roar echoed off the marble walls, a wild animal's cry born of wounded pride. His men, once shadows at his command, now stood fractured, some with their guns lowered, others backing slowly toward the door, unwilling to die for a leader who had already lost. Sweat drenched his face as his eyes darted around the room like a predator cornered. He saw Obinna standing by the doorway, trembling yet upright, and a vicious thought sparked in his mind. If he could not command his men with fear, perhaps he could still control the night with blood. With a sudden burst of movement, Ijike lunged across the room, snatching a pistol from one of the wavering robbers before the man could react. In one fluid motion, he spun and aimed directly at Obinna. The gasp that tore from Ngozi's throat inside the inner room was sharp enough to pierce the walls. "No!" she screamed, clutching her children tighter. Obinna froze, his breath trapped in his chest. For a split second, he saw his empire, his family, his entire world about to collapse into darkness at the twitch of Ijike's finger. But Ifeoma moved first. With the swiftness of a striking viper, she stepped between Obinna and the gun, her body shielding him. Her eyes locked on Ijike's with a fire that cut through his rage. "If you shoot tonight, Junior, you will not leave this house alive," she said, her voice low, steady, and terrifyingly certain. Ijike sneered, the pistol trembling in his hand. "Don't test me, Ifeoma. You think you're strong, but you left us. You betrayed us." His voice cracked under the weight of desperation. Ifeoma took a step closer, her chest rising and falling with calm defiance. "I didn't betray you," she said, her tone heavy with pain and memory. "I chose a different life. I chose not to drown in blood the way you did. And now look at you, a king without a kingdom, a leader without men." Her words sliced him open. The pistol shook visibly in his grip, not from lack of strength, but from the crumbling certainty that had once fueled him. His men stood silent, none rushing to his aid. The lantern's glow flickered over their faces, exposing shame, regret, and fear. Ijike's breathing grew ragged, and in that moment everyone saw it. The fall of a man who had built his power on fear, undone by the calm courage of a woman who refused to bow. The room quivered with a silence heavier than gunfire. Ijike's pistol still trembled in his hand, but the weight of Ifeoma's gaze bore down on him harder than bullets. His men, or what was left of them, had drifted back, their eyes refusing to meet his, their guns hanging uselessly by their sides. Chief Obinna, standing behind Ifeoma, felt both shielded and humbled. For years he had thought his money was his fortress, his guards his protection, but tonight he realized his survival rested on the shoulders of a woman he had barely acknowledged. Ijike's voice cracked as he tried to claw back dignity. You were one of us. You swore never to leave. We bled together. We buried together. How dare you stand here and judge me?" His words spilled not just anger but grief, a lament for the bond they once shared. Ifeoma's face softened for the first time, but her eyes still burned with truth. "Yes," she said quietly. "I was one of you. I carried guns. I watched brothers die. I walked the streets with the same hunger for power that eats you now. But I made a choice the night I saw my own blood soak into the ground, my little brother, shot in crossfire because of me. That night, Junior, I buried him with my own hands. And with him, I buried the life you still cling to." Her voice cracked slightly, but she stood tall, her pain turning into a blade sharper than steel. The revelation stunned the room. Chief Obinna's breath caught in his throat, his mind spinning. His maid, his silent, dutiful maid, had once been a gangster, a soldier of shadows, a woman carved from the same streets that now threatened his mansion. Ngozi gasped loudly from inside the inner room, clutching her children as if the confession itself were a storm. Ijike staggered back, the pistol lowering unconsciously. His face twisted with anguish, rage, and a grief he could no longer contain. "You left us to rot," he screamed, his voice breaking. "You think walking away makes you clean? You think burying him erased what we were?" Tears welled in his eyes, but they were tears of fury, not sorrow. Ifeoma stepped closer, her voice low and heavy, carrying the weight of years of silence. "Walking away didn't erase it, Junior. I live with it every night. The ghosts follow me in every silence, in every corner of this house. But I chose to let those ghosts turn me into something better, not worse. That's the difference between you and me. You feed your ghosts with blood. I starve mine with peace." Her words cracked something inside him. The pistol slipped slightly from his hand, clattering against the marble with a sound that echoed like judgment. And in that moment, the man who had terrorized Lagos, who had built his throne on fear, stood broken before the woman who had once been his sister in shadows, and who had now become his reckoning. The pistol's clang against the marble floor rang like the toll of a funeral bell. Ijike staggered, his chest heaving as if the air itself refused to enter his lungs. The gang that once followed him without question now stood scattered, their eyes filled with doubt, shame, and a creeping fear of the woman who had silenced him without firing a shot. "Pick up that gun!" Ejike roared, but his voice cracked, hollow, a lion's growl fading into a cough. None of his men moved. Instead, one by one, they lowered their weapons completely, their shoulders sagging as though chains had slipped from their backs. The youngest among them bent down, picked up the pistol, and instead of handing it back, he placed it on the table beside the lantern, shaking his head. "Oga, we done," he muttered, his voice trembling. "We no fit follow you again. This night don show us who we really dey." The others murmured in agreement, their silence a deeper betrayal than words. Ejike's knees buckled, fury battling helplessness in his eyes. For years, he had ruled them with fear, but fear had met its match in the calm defiance of a woman he once thought gone forever. Ifeoma stood rooted, her arms folded, her eyes never leaving his broken figure. She didn't need to gloat, her silence spoke louder than any triumph. Chief Obinna, trembling but steady, stepped forward at last, his voice heavy with awe. "You saved us," he whispered. The words seemed to echo in the vast room, even as his wife sobbed softly behind him. Ejike looked up at Ifeoma, his face a map of rage and despair. "You think you've won," he spat, his voice ragged. "You may have turned my men against me, but the streets will always remember me. You can't bury me twice." Ifeoma's expression didn't change, but her voice was as sharp as iron. "The streets won't remember you, Junior. They will forget you, just like they forget every man who thought himself untouchable. Fear dies faster than courage. Tonight is proof." Her words landed like blows. Ejike's shoulders slumped as the last of his pride drained away, leaving nothing but a shell of the man who once commanded an army of shadows. His men shuffled toward the door, some glancing at Ifeoma with something close to reverence. One whispered, "Ani, forgive us," before slipping into the night. And just like that, the wolves were gone, leaving their fallen king kneeling in the glow of the lantern, surrounded not by soldiers but by silence. The first light of dawn crept through the wide windows of the mansion, brushing the marble with a pale glow that made the events of the night feel like a fevered dream. But the scent of sweat, gunpowder, and fear clung too heavily in the air for anyone to believe it hadn't happened. Ejike knelt on the floor, his shoulders hunched, his head bowed like a dethroned king awaiting judgment. His men had deserted him, slipping into the shadows they once claimed to own, leaving him stripped of power and dignity. Chief Obinna stood in the middle of his sitting room, not as the proud millionaire who commanded wealth and respect, but as a man humbled by the revelation that true power sometimes comes dressed in silence. His wife, Ngozi, finally emerged from the inner room with the children clinging to her gown, their wide eyes fixed on Ifeoma. They looked at her not as the maid who once scrubbed their dishes, but as something altogether different. A guardian, a warrior, a storm in human form. The lantern on the table sputtered before dying, its flame bowing out as if it knew its role had ended. Ifeoma stood tall in the quiet that followed, her posture steady, her face unreadable. When the estate security finally arrived, accompanied by policemen armed and panting, they found not chaos but a scene that would forever etch itself into legend. A millionaire's mansion, untouched despite the night's invasion. A gang scattered by their own fractured loyalties. And at the center, a maid who had stood against the wolves and won. Ejike was dragged away in handcuffs, his curses ringing hollow against the weight of his downfall. The officers tried to question Ifeoma, but she offered little, only her name, spoken firmly, and the fact that she had once walked the same dark roads that birthed Ejike. News of the night spread like wildfire across Lagos, whispered in markets, retold in churches, and debated in beer parlors. The millionaires made faced armed robbers and broke their leader, people said, their voices tinged with awe. Chief Obinna watched the world spin around her story, and for the first time in his life, he felt smaller than the walls of his mansion. He approached her as the sun rose higher, his voice thick with something he had never shown her before, respect. "Ifeoma," he said softly, "you shocked the world. But more than that, you saved my family." She turned to him, her eyes carrying both pain and strength. "I didn't do it for the world, Chief. I did it because silence has a limit. And last night it was broken." With those words, she picked up her small bag from the corner, the same bag she had carried for years, and walked out into the morning light. No fanfare, no applause, just the quiet footsteps of a woman who had proven that the calmest waters often hide the fiercest storms. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and put on post notifications.